Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Glasshouse's lecture series, Exploring Fashion as a Critical Discourse. My name is Ashla, and I'm the moderator for the program on behalf of the Glasshouse. This series aims to critically consider fashion from multiple perspectives and bring these conversations outside the bounds of traditional institutions and instead to all of us here, as well as anyone with an interest in the field. Often in popular writings on fashion and its theory, you will notice fashion is spoken about as a field that, quote, reflects culture. Instead, we hope to reframe this viewpoint, exploring the multitude of ways that fashion creates and shapes culture in itself. This is important because it recasts fashion as a medium through which we have agency, and also highlights the ways that fashion has helped to not just reflect, but produce our cultural, social, and political realities. Our hope is that these lectures will open ideas and questions for you, and that you will continue to build on these discussions in your lives, communities, and ways of thinking and being in the world. It is an honor to be joined today by Dr. Francesca Granata, who will present her lecture, Fashioning Beyond the Norm, Experiments in Fashion in the 1980s and 1990s. In this talk, Granata examines fashion that upsets bodily and gender norms, the rules of propriety and beauty. Her lecture is a provocation and an attempt to escape what Foucault referred to as the anatomo-politics of the human body, the disciplining and optimal regimen of ourselves. In part, this is achieved through fashion, beauty, and health regimens. Granata demonstrates the ways that we began to witness a proliferation of, quote, bodies out of bounds, something that should be understood as a critique of these normative discourses. This critique takes place in the world of Leigh Bowery, Comme des Garçons, Margiela, and the turn of the 21st century, as well as through the influences of feminine's desire to open up and question gender norms, as well as the AIDS epidemic. Dr. Granata's research centers on modern and contemporary visual and material culture, with a particular focus on fashion history, theory, gender, and performance studies. She's the author of Experimental Fashion, Performance Art, Carnival, and the Grotesque Body, editor of collection Fashion Criticism, an anthology, which was the first of its kind, and published by Bloomsbury in February of 2021. She's also the editor and founder of the journal Fashion Projects. Granata is associate professor in the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons School of Design in New York City. Dr. Granata's work so beautifully reveals how fashion has and can continue to pluralize and deconstruct limitations of the normative self. In our view, this reconfiguration of the self begins to demonstrate how the carnivalization of fashion can move us towards a more egalitarian experience. We warmly welcome Dr. Granata and each of you to this dialogue, and we look forward to exploring the complexities of fashion together. Today's lecture will be about 30 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. And also please note that the images in this lecture are for a mature audience. Please feel free to submit questions at any point throughout the duration of the event, through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Dr. Granata, I will let you take it from here.
So as I was saying, thank you so much, Ashla and the Glasshouse, for having me in this lecture series, and thank you so much for the generous introduction. I will share my screen and I will walk you through, as I was saying, this argument for the importance of fashion as a cultural product that really shapes society, as opposed to just reflect it. So here, let me share my screen. Hopefully you can all see it now. So starting from the theoretical background of what I'm discussing, writing in the 1930s, the Russian scholar Michel Foucault characterized the grotesque as a phenomenon of reversal and of unsettling ruptures of borders, in particular bodily borders. The grotesque, Foucault argued, is an open and unfinished body which is never sealed or fully contained, but it is always in the process of becoming and creating another body. This theory has informed the current discussion on subjectivity in Acosta's state of becoming of critical posthumanism that are now quite widely discussed. But Back in the 1930s, in a book called Rabelais and His Word, Bakhtin theorized the open-ended collective body of Carnival as the grotesque body par excellence, in contrast to the sealed and individualized classical body. And he added that this struggle between the classical and grotesque concepts of the body within the West can be observed in a number of different areas, starting from the canon of behavior, which Bakhtin sees as an attempt to close up and limit the body's confines, to the history of dance and to fashion. In an endnote, he writes that it would be interesting to trace the struggle of the grotesque and the classical concept in the history of dress and fashion. And taking on this unrealized project, Bakhtin never really wrote explicitly about fashion. This lecture explores how this struggle between the grotesque and the classical body was played out at the end of the previous century, from the 1980s up to the turn of the millennium. The 1980s were the years in which planted the seeds for the more forceful break with classical fashion imagery that took place in the 1990s, a break whose ripples continue to make their effect felt in the new millennium. In this lecture, I will examine the reasons behind a proliferation of bodies out of bounds in fashion, starting in the 1980s. Why is that during this period, the sealed and quote-unquote perfect body of high fashion is forcefully challenged by fashion practitioners? So I argue that the bodies and subjects circulating with the experimental fashion at the turn of the millennium are undisciplined ones that upset gender and bodily norms and rules of propriety and beauty. They can be read as provocations and attempts to escape what Michel Foucault referred to as the anatomo-politics of the human body. So this disciplining and optimal management and self-management of the human body, which is in part achieved through fashion, beauty, and other health regimes. So I view fashion in its mainstream variety on a continuum with a number of these technologies of the self at work in neoliberal society. Fashion can be in line with discourses of health and fitness, promoting these kind of normative bodies and subjects, a process that I argue began to intensify starting in the 80s, which is also the starting point of my exploration. It is, in fact, also in the 80s that we began to witness a proliferation of grotesque imageries and bodies out of bounds in fashion, something that should be understood as a critique towards these normative discourses. I argue that this shift, which was particularly evident within experimental fashion at the turn of the 21st century, was in fact influenced by feminism's desire to open up and question gender and body norms, and particularly the normative bodies of fashion, of course, but it was also tied to the AIDS epidemic. Experimental fashion often mediated the fears of contagion and the obsessive moral policing of bodily borders that characterized the 1980s and part of the 1990s, and cannot be read separately from the powerful discourses of contagions, bodies, and health surrounding the AIDS crisis. Starting in the 80s, in fact, a climate of fear and paranoia almost surrounded bodily borders, and particularly those of urban gay men within the US and much of Europe. AIDS, as Susan Sontag wrote, was constructed through a politically and socially conservative discourse as, quote, a disease not only of sexual excess, but of perversity, end quote. So fashion was central to the visual and material culture of those decades, and it played an important role alongside performance, visual arts, dance, film, photography, in teasing through the political and social issues that characterized these decades. Throughout the lecture, I argue that fashion should be interpreted on par with other aspects of visual and material culture as a constitutive and influential part of culture, as opposed to simply reflecting a culture that gets made elsewhere. So the designer discussed in this lecture tackling feminist issues about the pregnant bodies represented in visual culture of the 80s and 90s, as well as challenging anxieties over body borders characterizing the period. They're questioning norms and standards of beauty, as well as exploring changing ideas of masculinity at the beginning of the millennium. They often do so through collaboration with other practitioners whose work has been discussed in relation to these cultural shifts, as evident perhaps with most evident with Ray Kawakubo of Comme the Garçons, collaboration with Cindy Sherman, which you see here in this slide. At this point, the artist Cindy Sherman was exploring an abstract aesthetics, and that's the point of her career in which she collaborated with Ray Kawakubo of Comme the Garçons for a series of ads that you see on screen. So these designers, I argue, also move a critique to power and status dressing and its attendant neoliberal enterprising culture. The 1980s was in fact a period associated with the development of neoliberalism, most visibly in the UK and the US, through Thatcherite and Reaganite economic policies that favored free markets, free trade, small government. So this shifted responsibility from the state to the individual and private enterprises. Thus, it is no surprise that the fashion designers I discuss often also mediated these political and social shifts in their work. And this lecture provides an evidence to the centrality again of fashion to contemporary culture and the way it responded to social and political shifts. Throughout the lecture, I examined the kind of fashion that was circulating fairly widely as an image, primarily in independent style magazines throughout the 80s and 90s, remained elusive as a product, as it was usually produced in limited runs and deemed challenging. As the term suggests, it is the kind of fashion that experiments with silhouettes, constructions, materials, and/or modes of presentations. At the border of fashion itself, the work I discuss often spills into the realm of performance art. This shares with fashion a deep relation to the body and gender and constitutes an important cultural trope for exploring the grotesque body and bodily practices. So an important theme which surfaces in an application of Bakhtin's theories to fashion design of this period is its relation to the maternal body. I examined the work of Ray Kawakubo, Georgina Gottlieb, and Leigh Bowery, all of whom from the mid-80s to the late 90s presented a seemingly pregnant silhouette. They constructed garments suggesting the maternal body, a model of a body in process, which sharply contrasted with the 20th century fashion silhouettes in general, and with the masculinized broad-shouldered silhouettes of the 1980s fashion in particular. This silhouette, which was epitomized by the so-called power suit that we saw in the previous slides, this garment was deeply implicated with neoliberal ideas of the enterprising self and sartorial engineering promoted during this period through a range of media, including the then famous dress manual by John Molloy titled Women Dress for Success, and films such as Working Girl. So to return to Kawakubo, employing Bakhtin's theories of the grotesque, which I talked about earlier, and Kristeva's notion of the subject in process, alongside medical anthropologies and science studies, I examine how late 20th century experimental fashion problematized demarcations between bodily boundaries and questions the integrity of the subject via reference to the pregnant body and birth processes. Gottlieb, Bowery, and Kawakubo reappropriated the relation between the grotesque, the feminine, and the maternal to create work which challenged the sealed and contained body characteristic of much 20th century fashion. This model, which conforms to Bakhtin's definition of the classical body, can be read not only in relation to a latent gynophobia, meaning the fear of the maternal, in dominant Western thought and representational tradition, but also in relation to neoliberal models of selfhood, which developed during this period. So the work of Japanese designer Rei Kawakubo, and in particular Spring-Summer 1997 collection, Body Meets Dress for Comme des Garçons, subverts the masculine silhouette and super healthy or uber healthy toned body introduced in the previous decades through the very means used to create such silhouette. She used padding, which had been traditionally used to build up the shoulder, to create oddly shaped bodies with protruding regions on the back, the hips, and the belly. The Japanese designers also collaborated in occasion of this collection with New York-based choreographer Merce Cunningham for the dance scenario, which premiered at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in '97, and allowed the designer to create even more extremely padded costume and to submit them to a much greater range of motions. The dancers' costumes came with prominently enhanced protruding areas on both the front and back of the torso, particularly the hips and buttocks, which quite literally brought to mind the sprouts and bulges of the Bakhtin's grotesque body. The way Kawakubo's garments became activated by the dancer body's emotion allowed for the creation of novel and unexpected bodily formation, which at times refer to the pregnant body, yet this reference to maternity is more often enacted on the body of male dancers. As underscores in the poster for the dance, which is a close-up of the choreographer and dancer Merce Cunningham himself wearing one of those costumes protruding in the front, thus giving the impression of pregnancy. Yet the dance also leads into uncharted formations and articulation of the body. Her costumes, together with the choreography of Cunningham, allow for a remapping, a reformulation of the body, which invokes the maternal as a model for a subject that is tolerant of alterity, in a deep awareness of his or her own difference. So to shift our attention to another practitioner of the 80s and 90s, here is a photo of the Australian-born, British-based fashion designer, club figure, and performance artist, Leigh Bowery, who was an in-between figure whose work could not really be easily assimilated in fashion or art, at least during his lifetime. Bowery constituted a modern-day incarnation of the carnival spirit, whose practice questioned strict divisions between art and life. He employed humor to disrupt gender and body boundaries, and through his elaborate costumes, which were at the basis of his performances, he created a fully artificial self. According to his wife, Nicola Bowery, he was initially ashamed of his size, which did not conform to the rather well-toned and fit look popular at the time. This look was best epitomized by the Calvin Klein underwear ads photographed first by Bruce Weber. Here we see on one side Bowery in a club costume, and the other side sees a body of an Olympian pole vaulter immortalized by Weber in the 1982 campaign, which embodied this healthy, beautiful body, male body in its wholesome classical beauty. This kind of male body presented in the 80s an antidote to the threat represented by AIDS and the fear of the illness. Some of Bowery's more iconic costumes or looks from the late 80s also make reference to the pregnant body. And these references culminated in his birth performances with his band Minty. His birthing performances, in its graphic and threatening quality, externalized and rendered visible the problematic Western understanding of the maternal body, and by extension, the female body, with its unstable borders and generative potential, as grotesque and in some way monstrous. I argue that in their references to birth processes and exchange of bodily fluids, Bowery's performance placed on a continuum the bodies of pregnant women and gay men as grotesque and immunologically problematic, particularly considering that their contemporary context and Bowery's untimely death from complication of AIDS in 1994. And then I want to briefly also talk about designer Margiela, and I will try to, in this lecture, recuperate the carnivalesque and grotesque elements of deconstruction fashion and read it in relation to humor and carnivalesque humor in particular. I will do so with a particular focus on Margiela, the Belgian designer, since the term was coined for Margiela's work. And here are some spreads from Details magazine of the Maison Margiela very early collections. So a close analysis of individual pieces and specific presentation by Margiela unveils the grotesque and carnivalesque strategies of alteration of scales, garments inversion, and play with functionality, as well as display and inversion of linear temporalities. As is the case with Kawakubo, Leigh, and Bowery, Margiela, in a number of his collections and presentations, explores a grotesque non-normative body, which stands in contrast to the classical body of fashion in general, while rejecting 1980s aesthetic language through the use of recycling, the ready-made, and seemingly unfinished and torn garments. Margiela's close disregard for symmetry and proportionality append and question Western ideals of beauty and classical aesthetics, while his presentation and exhibitions make references to processes of birth and growth. The connection between Margiela's work and the grotesque can be best observed in his oversized and enlarged collections. These collections make reference to the gigantic and the miniature by scaling garments to non-existent sizes and enlarging Barbie and Ken doll clothes to human size. Through these alterations of scale, coupled with garments inversions and play with functionality, these collections are not only reminiscent of surrealist strategies, of course, but are aligned with a Bakhtinian understanding of the grotesque as the ultimate expression of the carnival spirit. In the oversized collections, they Margiela enlarges individual garments from an Italian 42 to sizes ranging from 76 to 80. And with its usual meticulousness, Margiela enlarges each aspect of the garment down to its details, so button zips, and to the accessory which complete the collections, such as earring and sunglasses. So the way is enlarging a garment is, of course, different than regular sizing or grading processes by which a garment is not enlarged the same width and height. So it creates disproportional garments. And as you see here, it also created a number of collections that enlarged Barbie dolls and Ken dolls clothing. So a customized 1930s dressmaker form whose proportion had been altered served as an inspiration for Margiela's first enlarged collections. This altered form, as well as Margiela's altered clothes, questioned the normative body of fashion. From the perspective of dress history, in fact, sizing is itself a normative strategy. It developed in Europe starting in the 18th century in the context of military wear, and particularly the Royal Navy, with the intent to standardize and render uniform what was perceived as a motley crew so that they could probably represent the British Empire. It is not by chance that this normative sizing strategy articulated through dress occurred alongside new regulatory techniques and forms of power. As Foucault, once again, has argued, it is through the 18th century that new forms of power, which remain at work today, took hold. This period saw the development of biopower, a power that's to qualify, measure a price. It affects distribution around the norm. And as I've argued, this process is intensified in the 1980s when technologies of the self, such as fitness and cosmetic surgery, took hold and gained greater popularity. So going back to the specific of this collection, many of the knits were stiff as they'd undergone a kind of molding process. They had been molded to an Italian size 78, and so they would retain the same large form around the wearer, regardless of the wearer's size. Thanks to the molding process they underwent, the clothes retained this gargantuan shape when unworn. The sweaters are in fact reminiscent of fat suits, a further reference to bodies out of bounds. Thus, Margiela's enlarged garments and its interest in non-normative bodies share with Kawakubo, Leigh, and Bowery an interest in moving away from prescribed body types, which in their case was articulated instead primarily through reference to the pregnant body. So to conclude, these designers and artists whose work I discussed throughout the lecture clearly interjected and mediated the cultural politics that surrounded them in an attempt to shift or at least critique the grounds of acceptable norms in fashion. For instance, Leigh and Kawakubo intervened in feminist theory through a reconception of the body of fashion, and in the process provided a critique of 1980s neoliberal enterprising culture. Bowery instead mediated the increasing visibility of queer bodies and challenged fears surrounding bodily borders at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the West. Bowery, Leigh, and Kawakubo reinscribed the pregnant body in all of its potential for ruptures of borders, immunological instability, and new conceptual subjectivities to fashion of the 80s and 90s. While Margiela, throughout the period I discussed, moved a critique to the normative body of fashion through its ingenious play with sizing. its garment's disregard for symmetry and proportionality append and question Western ideals of beauty and classical aesthetics. And it's important to note that this exploration of the grotesque as a category has not ended in with the practitioner that I discussed, with the designer I discussed, but has continued in the 21st century through a number of experimental designers, most notably perhaps the Dutch designer Iris van Herpen, whose work experiments with materials and silhouettes and new technologies, as well as the work of brands such as Hood by Hair, as well, and Rick Owens, who in this case, for instance, in the Spring-Summer 2016 collection, is making direct reference to Leigh Bowery work that integrated like two bodies into one's, quite literally. So that said, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, and I look forward to your questions.